The morning sun cast long shadows across Windsor Castle's ancient stones as Kate Middleton stood before her bedroom mirror, her reflection showing a woman who had learned to wear strength like armor. Today would be different from all the others. She could feel it in the way the air seemed to hold its breath, in the unusual silence that had settled over the castle corridors where staff moved with careful, measured steps. William had been distant for weeks now, buried in meetings that stretched late into the night, phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered the room. The weight of the crown had always been heavy, but, lately, it seemed to be crushing something vital between them. Their conversations had become polite exchanges about schedules and children, carefully avoiding the growing chasm that neither wanted to acknowledge. Kate's fingers trembled slightly as she fastened her pearl necklace, the same one she had worn on their wedding day. The irony wasn't lost on her that today, of all days, she would choose to wear a symbol of their beginning when everything felt like it was ending. The children had already left for school, their cheerful voices echoing through the halls just an hour earlier, blissfully unaware of the tension that had been building like a storm cloud over their parents' marriage. The previous evening had been particularly difficult. William had returned from yet another crisis meeting with his private secretary, his face drawn with exhaustion and something else Kate couldn't quite identify. She had prepared his favorite dinner, hoping to create a moment of normalcy between them, but he had barely touched his food. Instead, he sat across from her at their private dining table, staring at something she couldn't see, lost in thoughts he wouldn't share. The children asked about our anniversary trip. Kate had ventured carefully, knowing how even the smallest mention of their personal life seemed to agitate him lately. Should I tell them we'll discuss it later? William had looked up then, and, for a moment, she saw the man she had fallen in love with at university. Vulnerable, uncertain, beautifully human. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the mask of duty he wore so well. Later, he had said simply, and returned to pushing food around his plate. Now, as Kate made her way down the castle's grand staircase, she could hear the familiar sounds of William's morning routine from his study. The rustling of newspapers, the quiet murmur of his voice as he spoke with his equerry about the day's schedule. These sounds had once been comforting, part of the rhythm of their life together. Today, they felt like the ticking of a clock counting down to something irreversible. The media had been speculating for months about the state of their marriage. Photographs were scrutinized for signs of distance, body language experts offered their opinions on television programs, and gossip magazines crafted elaborate theories about secret arguments and separate bedrooms. Most of it was nonsense, but some of it cut uncomfortably close to the truth. Kate had learned to ignore the speculation, but she knew it weighed heavily on William, who had grown up watching his mother navigate similar scrutiny. As she entered the morning room where they typically shared breakfast, Kate found the table set for one. This small detail hit her with unexpected force. Even Mrs. Henderson, their longtime housekeeper, seemed to understand that something fundamental had shifted. The older woman had worked for the royal family for decades and possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense the emotional temperature of the household. Kate sat alone at the polished table, her cup of tea growing cold as she stared out at the gardens where she and William had once walked hand in hand, planning their future together. Those early days of their marriage had been filled with such hope and determination. They had believed their love could withstand anything, that they could modernize the monarchy while staying true to each other. The sound of footsteps in the corridor made her heart race with anticipation and dread. William appeared in the doorway, impeccably dressed as always, but there was something different about him today. His usual morning greeting died on his lips as their eyes met across the room. In that moment, Kate saw everything she needed to know. The decision had already been made. "We need to talk," he said quietly, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. Kate nodded, not trusting her voice. She had been preparing for this conversation for weeks, rehearsing what she might say, how she might fight for them. But now, faced with the reality of it, she found herself strangely calm. Perhaps this was what acceptance felt like, not the peaceful resolution she had imagined, but a quiet surrender to what had become inevitable. William moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture she recognized from countless public appearances. Even now, in this most private moment, he couldn't quite shed the formal bearing that had been drilled into him since childhood. Kate wondered if he even remembered how to be just William anymore, not the Prince of Wales, not the future king, but simply the man she had married. "The pressure has become unbearable," he said without turning around. "Not just the public scrutiny, but the impossible balance between duty and us. Kate set down her teacup with careful precision. I've never asked you to choose between duty and me, William. I've only asked you to include me in your world, not shut me out of it. He turned then, and she saw the exhaustion etched in every line of his face. This wasn't the dramatic confrontation she had feared, with raised voices and accusations. Instead, it felt like watching someone slowly drowning, unable to save themselves or accept help. You don't understand, William said, his voice barely above a whisper. The things I've learned, the decisions I'll have to make as king, they change everything. They change who I am, and I can't ask you to love someone I'm not even sure I recognize anymore. The morning lights streaming through the tall windows cast everything in sharp relief, the distance between them, the careful way they both held themselves, the weight of unspoken words. Kate had always been strong, but she had never felt as alone as she did in that moment, sitting across from the man who had once promised to share everything with her. Outside, the world continued as normal. Gardeners tended to the rose bushes, security personnel made their rounds, and, somewhere in the distance, the sound of helicopters suggested that the media was already gathering for what would become one of the most photographed days in modern royal history. But, inside this quiet room, two people who had once believed in forever were learning how to say goodbye. The conversation that followed would be remembered not for its drama, but for its devastating quietness. There were no accusations, no bitter recriminations. Instead, there was a recognition that sometimes love isn't enough to bridge the gap between two people whose paths have diverged too far to find their way back to each other. As the morning wore on, Kate found herself memorizing details she had never noticed before. The way William's voice dropped when he was trying not to show emotion, the particular shade of gray his eyes became when he was sad, the unconscious gesture he made of touching his wedding ring when he was nervous. These observations felt important somehow, as if she was collecting pieces of him to carry with her into whatever came next. The formal arrangements would be discussed later with lawyers and advisors and all the machinery of the monarchy. But this moment belonged only to them. The end of a love story that had once captured the imagination of the world, dissolving quietly in the morning light of a room where they had shared countless breakfasts and dreams of a future that now seemed as distant as a fairy tale. When the conversation finally ended, they sat in silence for several long minutes, both of them seemingly reluctant to take the first step toward the door. Kate understood that walking away from this room would make everything real in a way that words could not. Once they left this space, they would have to begin the careful process of untangling a life they had built together, of learning how to be separate people again after years of being part of something larger. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they weren't saying, everything they couldn't take back. And, in that silence, Kate began to understand that sometimes the most profound goodbyes happen without words at all, in the space between heartbeats, in the moment when two people finally accept that their story has reached its end. The afternoon brought an unusual flurry of activity to Windsor Castle, though to the outside world, it appeared to be just another busy day in the life of the royal family. Staff members moved with practiced efficiency, but there was an undercurrent of tension that those who knew the family well could sense immediately. Mrs. Henderson had noticed at first, the way the prince and princess moved through the castle like two ships passing in the night, carefully avoiding any space the other might occupy. Kate had retreated to the blue drawing room, a space that had always brought her comfort with its soft furnishings and walls lined with family photographs spanning generations. Today, however, those same photographs seemed to mock her with their portrayal of enduring love and royal stability. She picked up a silver frame containing a picture from their wedding day, William's face radiant with joy, her own eyes bright with hope and determination. It felt like looking at strangers. The irony of their situation wasn't lost on her. They had weathered so many storms together, the intense media scrutiny of their courtship, the pressures of royal life, the constant balancing act between public duty and private happiness. They had emerged stronger from each challenge, or so she had believed. But this final test had proved too much, not because of any external force, but because of the gradual erosion of the very foundation their marriage was built upon. William spent the afternoon in his private study, surrounded by red boxes and official papers that demanded his attention. But his mind kept wandering to the woman just rooms away, the mother of his children, the person who had once been his closest confidant. He remembered their early days together at university, when she had been simply Kate, a girl who could make him laugh and forget about the weight of his destiny? When had that lightness disappeared? When had their love become another duty to manage? The children's return from school provided a temporary reprieve from the heavy atmosphere that had settled over the castle. Their voices echoed through the corridors as they recounted their day's adventures, blissfully unaware of the seismic shift occurring in their family. Kate forced herself to engage with their chatter about homework and friends, grateful for the normalcy they brought to a day that felt anything but normal. "Mummy, why didn't Daddy read us stories last night?" asked their youngest, with the kind of innocent observation that cuts straight to the heart of adult complications. Kate's throat tightened as she struggled to find an appropriate response. "Daddy has been very busy with important work lately," she managed, the words feeling like glass in her mouth. The lie was necessary, but it felt like another small betrayal in a day already full of them. As evening approached, the castle's daily rhythms continued unchanged. Dinner was prepared, schedules were reviewed, and tomorrow's engagements were finalized. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, two people were quietly preparing for a life they had never imagined they would have to live. Kate found herself making mental notes about arrangements that would need to be made, conversations that would need to happen, explanations that would need to be crafted for a world that would demand answers. The media, always vigilant for signs of drama within the royal family, had begun to sense that something was amiss. Photographers with long lenses had gathered outside the castle gates, and royal correspondents were making careful inquiries with their sources inside the palace. The machinery of speculation was already beginning to turn, though none of them could have imagined the true scope of what was unfolding behind Windsor's ancient walls. Kate's private secretary had arrived earlier in the afternoon, carrying herself with the kind of professional composure that suggested she was already aware of the day's developments. The conversation they shared was brief and businesslike, focused on the practical necessities that would need to be addressed in the coming days. There would be statements to draft, schedules to rearrange, and a careful choreography of public appearances to manage until the official announcement could be made. William's own team of advisors had been equally discreet in their consultations. The constitutional implications of a separation, while not unprecedented, required careful consideration. The monarchy had survived such crises before, but each one brought its own unique challenges and opportunities for both modernization and potential damage to the institution's reputation. As dinner time approached, both Kate and William found themselves faced with the strange ritual of sharing a meal with their children while maintaining the pretense that nothing had changed. The dining room, which had hosted countless family gatherings filled with laughter and easy conversation, felt transformed into a stage where every word had to be carefully considered, every gesture analyzed for signs of the truth they were working so hard to conceal. The children, with their natural intuition, seemed to sense the undercurrent of tension, but couldn't quite identify its source. Conversation was more stilted than usual, punctuated by longer silences than the family typically experienced. Kate found herself overcompensating, asking too many questions about school and activities, while William remained largely quiet, offering only brief responses when directly addressed. After dinner, as the children settled into their evening routines with their nannies, Kate and William found themselves alone again for the first time since their morning conversation. The silence between them had evolved throughout the day, becoming less painful but somehow more final. There was an odd sense of relief in no longer having to pretend that everything was normal, even as they faced the daunting reality of what lay ahead. They walked together through the castle's long gallery, a space lined with portraits of previous generations who had faced their own challenges and crises. Kate found herself wondering what advice those long-dead relatives might offer, what wisdom they had gained from their own experiences of love and loss, duty and sacrifice. The weight of history seemed particularly heavy in that moment, as if the very walls were witnesses to another chapter in the long story of the royal family. The practical discussions they needed to have felt overwhelming in their scope. There were custody arrangements to consider, financial matters to address, and the complex question of Kate's future role within the royal family. Would she retain her titles? What would her relationship with the institution be going forward? These questions had no easy answers, and both of them understood that the decisions they made in the coming days would have far-reaching consequences. As the evening wore on, Kate found herself in the castle's library, surrounded by books that had provided comfort and escape throughout her years as a royal. She pulled down a volume of poetry that William had given her early in their marriage, inscribed with words of love that now seemed to belong to different people entirely. The inscription read, "To my dearest Kate, may we always find our way back to each other." The cruel irony of those words in light of the day's events was almost unbearable. William, meanwhile, had returned to his study, but the official papers remained untouched on his desk. Instead, he found himself staring at a photograph of his mother, wondering what Diana would have made of his decision. She had always emphasized the importance of following one's heart, but she had also understood better than anyone the crushing weight of royal expectations and the toll they could take on personal happiness. The night staff moved quietly through the castle, preparing for what they sensed would be one of the last normal evenings the family would share for quite some time. Beds were turned down, security was briefed, and tomorrow's schedules were reviewed one final time. The machinery of royal life continued to function with clockwork precision, even as the very foundation of that life was quietly crumbling. As midnight approached, both Kate and William found themselves unable to sleep, each lost in their own thoughts about the future that awaited them. The castle around them held its breath, as if the very stones understood that they were witnesses to a moment that would be remembered long after the immediate pain had faded. In just a few hours, the world would begin to learn that one of its most watched couples had decided that sometimes, even the greatest love stories must come to an end. The silence between them had become their final gift to each other, a recognition that words were no longer necessary, that they had moved beyond explanation into a realm where only understanding remained. Tomorrow would bring chaos and questions, analysis and speculation. But tonight, in the quiet corridors of Windsor Castle, two people were learning how to say goodbye without ever having to speak the words aloud. The morning of what would later be called the day that changed everything began with an unusual quiet at Windsor Castle. Even the groundskeepers seemed to move with more deliberate care, as if sensing that the very air around them carried the weight of momentous change. Kate had risen before dawn, unable to remain in bed as her mind raced with thoughts of the day ahead and all the days that would follow. She dressed with particular care, choosing a navy blue dress that had always been one of William's favorites, though she couldn't say exactly why she felt compelled to make that choice. Perhaps it was a final gesture of respect for what they had shared, or maybe it was simply the comfort of familiar routines in a day that promised to be anything but familiar. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman who had learned to compose herself for public scrutiny, but her eyes betrayed the emotional turmoil that no amount of royal training could completely disguise. The breakfast room felt different this morning, charged with an energy that made even the simple act of pouring tea feel significant. William appeared precisely at 8 o'clock, as punctual as always, but there was something in his bearing that suggested this wasn't just another day of royal duties. He wore his navy uniform, the one reserved for the most formal occasions, and Kate understood immediately that this choice was intentional. Today, he would be speaking not just as her husband, but as the future king. Their private secretary had arrived earlier than usual, bringing with her a folder of documents that would need to be signed and statements that had been carefully crafted by the palace's most senior advisors. The machinery of royal crisis management had been quietly set in motion, operating with the kind of efficiency that comes from decades of experience managing the personal dramas of public figures. The children had been carefully managed that morning, their routines adjusted to ensure they would be occupied during the most critical hours of the day. Kate's heart ached as she kissed them goodbye before their departure for school, knowing that when they returned that evening, their world would have fundamentally changed. The innocent trust in their eyes as they hugged her tightly was almost more than she could bear. "Will you pick us up from school today, Mummy?" asked their daughter, and Kate had to swallow hard before responding with a careful smile. "We'll see how the day goes, darling. But remember that, Daddy, and I love you very much, no matter what happens." The child accepted this somewhat cryptic response with the easy trust of youth, but Kate caught a flicker of something in William's eyes that suggested he understood the weight of her words. They were already beginning the delicate process of protecting their children from the storm that was about to break around them. By mid-morning, the castle's atmosphere had shifted perceptibly. Senior staff members moved with increased urgency. Phones rang more frequently than usual, and there was a sense of barely contained energy that seemed to radiate from the very walls. The press office had been quietly briefing key journalists, preparing them for an announcement that would dominate headlines around the world for weeks to come. Kate found herself in the blue drawing room once again, but this time she wasn't alone. Her closest friend and confidant, Sarah, had arrived to provide moral support during what everyone knew would be one of the most difficult days of Kate's life. They sat together in companionable silence for long stretches, occasionally sharing memories of happier times or discussing practical matters that would need attention in the coming weeks. "Do you regret it?" Sarah asked gently during one of their quiet conversations. "Any of it?" Kate considered the question carefully, her gaze drifting to the portraits on the walls that depicted generations of royal marriages, some successful, others marked by scandal and separation. "I regret that we couldn't find our way through it together," she said finally. "But I don't regret loving him, or the family we created, or even the years of trying to make it work. Some stories are worth living, even when they don't have the ending you hoped for." Meanwhile, William had sequestered himself with his private secretary and a small group of senior advisors, reviewing the statement that would be released to the public later that afternoon. Every word had been scrutinized for its potential impact, every phrase tested for its constitutional implications. The announcement would need to strike a careful balance between acknowledging the personal nature of the decision while reassuring the public about the stability of the monarchy itself. The Queen had been informed, of course, and her response had been characteristically measured and supportive. She had lived through enough family crises to understand that the institution could weather this storm, but she also recognized the personal cost to those involved. Her brief conversation with William that morning had been filled with the kind of quiet wisdom that comes from decades of navigating the complex intersection of personal happiness and public duty. As the afternoon approached, the final preparations began in earnest. Photographers were positioned in strategic locations around the castle, though none of them yet knew exactly what they would be documenting. Royal correspondents checked and double-checked their sources, sensing that a major story was about to break, but unable to pin down the specifics. The anticipation was palpable, even among those who weren't yet aware of what they were anticipating. Kate's personal staff had begun the delicate process of organizing her belongings, a task that felt both premature and necessary. Decisions had to be made about what would remain at Windsor and what would accompany her to whatever new arrangement would be established. Each choice felt weighted with symbolism: which photographs to take, which books to keep, which pieces of jewelry held too much emotional significance to leave behind. The moment everyone had been dreading finally arrived when the castle's bells chimed 3 o'clock. It was time for Kate and William to make their final journey together through the corridors they had walked as husband and wife. The staff they passed stood respectfully, their faces carefully neutral, but their eyes betraying the sadness they felt for this family they had served with such dedication. They walked to the long gallery, where a small group of senior advisors and family friends had gathered to witness what would essentially be their formal farewell. The space felt transformed from an elegant reception room into something resembling a courtroom, though the proceedings would be far more gentle than any legal dissolution. The statements were read, documents were signed, and arrangements were finalized with the kind of efficiency that only comes from careful advance planning. But beneath the formality and procedure, everyone in the room understood they were witnessing the end of something that had once inspired hope and joy in millions of people around the world. When the official business was concluded, Kate and William found themselves alone for what they both knew would be the last time as husband and wife. The silence between them was different now, no longer heavy with unspoken tension, but filled instead with a kind of peaceful resignation. They had said everything that needed to be said, and now there was only the simple act of letting go. They stood facing each other in the center of the gallery, surrounded by portraits of their ancestors who had faced their own trials and tribulations. For a moment, it seemed as though one of them might speak, might find words that could somehow change what was about to happen. But the moment passed, and they simply looked at each other with the kind of understanding that transcends language. William reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew something small, Kate's engagement ring, which she had quietly removed earlier that morning and given to him during one of their private conversations. He held it out to her, not as an offer for her to put it back on, but as a gesture of returning something that would always belong to her, regardless of their changed circumstances. Kate accepted the ring with steady hands, closing her fingers around it as she met his eyes one final time. In that exchange, without a single word being spoken, they managed to convey everything that couldn't be captured in official statements or legal documents. They were saying goodbye not just to their marriage, but to the dreams they had shared, the future they had planned, and the people they had been when they believed love could conquer any obstacle. The afternoon light streaming through the gallery's tall windows seemed to freeze this moment in time, creating a tableau that would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it. Here were two people who had genuinely loved each other, who had tried with everything they had to make their impossible situation work, finally accepting that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to set someone free. When they finally turned and walked in opposite directions down the long gallery, their footsteps echoing off the ancient walls, everyone present understood they had witnessed something extraordinary. Not the dramatic end that might have been expected, but something far more profound, a demonstration that even the most public love stories can end with dignity, respect, and a recognition that some bonds, once forged, can never be completely broken, even when they must be transformed into something entirely different. The press conference was scheduled for 5 o'clock, giving the palace communications team just enough time to ensure that all major news outlets had been properly briefed and positioned. The state dining room at Windsor Castle had been transformed into an impromptu media center, with cameras and lighting equipment carefully arranged to capture what would become one of the most significant royal announcements in decades. Kate had chosen to watch from a private viewing room, connected to the main space by a discreet audiovisual system that would allow her to witness William's statement without being seen by the assembled press corps. She sat alone, having declined the offer of company from her staff or friends, understanding instinctively that this was something she needed to experience in solitude. As William entered the state dining room, the familiar click and whir of cameras filled the air, creating a soundtrack that had become the background music of their public life together. He moved to the prepared podium with the measured steps of someone who had spent years training for moments exactly like this one, though nothing could have truly prepared him for the weight of what he was about to announce. The text of his statement had been rehearsed multiple times throughout the afternoon, but as William looked out at the expectant faces of the journalists and photographers, he found himself departing from the carefully crafted script. Instead, he spoke from the heart, his voice carrying a tone of quiet sadness that no amount of royal training could disguise. "The Princess of Wales and I have made the difficult decision to separate," he began, the words falling into a silence so complete that even the usual background noise of camera shutters seemed muted. "This decision has not been made lightly, and it comes after much consideration and discussion between us both." Kate felt her breath catch as she listened to William's voice through the audio system. Even now, knowing what was coming, hearing him speak the words aloud made everything feel startlingly real. This was no longer a private decision between two people. It was about to become public property, subject to analysis and speculation from every corner of the globe. William continued with remarkable composure, outlining the arrangements that had been made for their children and emphasizing their commitment to co-parenting effectively despite their changed circumstances. He spoke about the respect and affection that remained between them, and his words carried a sincerity that seemed to surprise even the most cynical members of the press corps. "We ask for privacy during this difficult time, particularly for our children, who remain our primary concern," Williams said, his voice growing slightly stronger as he approached the end of his prepared remarks. "The Princess of Wales has been an exemplary mother and partner, and she will always have my deepest respect and gratitude for the years we have shared together." As William concluded his statement and prepared to leave the podium without taking questions, a decision that had been made to avoid any potential for misinterpretation or sensationalization, Kate found herself moved by his grace under what had to be extraordinary pressure. Even in this moment of personal crisis, he had managed to protect both her dignity and their children's privacy while fulfilling his obligation to inform the public. The aftermath of the announcement was swift and overwhelming. Within minutes, news alerts were pinging on phones around the world. Social media was exploding with reactions and theories, and television news programs were hastily rearranging their schedules to provide extended coverage of this breaking story. The machinery of modern media had been unleashed, and there would be no controlling where it went from here. Kate's phone, which had been switched off during the press conference, immediately began buzzing with calls and messages when she turned it back on. Friends, family members, and colleagues all wanted to reach out, some offering support, others seeking confirmation or additional details. She found herself overwhelmed by the outpouring of concern and affection, even as she recognized that her private life had officially become public domain. The children's school had been alerted in advance, and arrangements had been made to ensure they could be collected discreetly before news of their parents' separation became widespread. Kate's heart ached as she thought about the conversations she would need to have with them that evening, trying to explain in age-appropriate terms why their family was changing while reassuring them of the love that would never waver. As evening fell over Windsor Castle, the building took on an almost surreal quality. The normal rhythms of royal life continued. Dinner was prepared, security rotations proceeded as scheduled, and tomorrow's engagements were reviewed. But everything felt fundamentally altered. The staff moved with extra consideration, speaking in slightly lower voices, and handling even routine tasks with unusual care. Kate had requested a private dinner in her sitting room, unable to face the formal dining room where she and William had shared so many meals together. The tray that arrived contained all her favorite foods, carefully prepared by kitchen staff who had been serving her for years and who understood that this might be one of their last opportunities to provide this small comfort. As she picked at her meal, Kate found herself reflecting on the strange turns her life had taken. 20 years ago, she had been a university student with no particular royal aspirations, content to pursue her studies and see where life might lead her. The woman she was now, poised, dignified, capable of handling intense public scrutiny, felt like someone she had grown into rather than someone she had always been. The evening news programs provided extensive coverage of the day's announcement, with royal experts and constitutional scholars offering their analysis of what this separation might mean for the monarchy. Kate watched some of these discussions with a mixture of fascination and bewilderment, amazed by how confidently commentators could speculate about her private thoughts and feelings based on nothing more than carefully worded press statements. William, meanwhile, had retreated to his private study, where he was working through a stack of messages from family members, government officials, and close friends. The responses ranged from formal expressions of support to more personal notes offering comfort and understanding. His father had called within an hour of the announcement, providing the kind of steady reassurance that comes from someone who has navigated his own share of personal crises in the public eye. The international reaction had been swift and varied. Some foreign press treated the story as a major constitutional crisis, while others focused on the human drama of a marriage ending under intense scrutiny. Social media was filled with everything from expressions of sympathy to wild conspiracy theories about what had really led to the separation. Kate found herself both grateful for and disturbed by the intensity of public interest in their private lives. As the night wore on, both Kate and William found themselves drawn to their children's bedrooms, where peaceful sleep provided a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted in the adult world. Standing in the doorway watching their youngest daughter sleep, Kate felt a fierce protectiveness that strengthened her resolve to handle this transition with as much grace as possible, for their sake if not for her own. The castle's night shift had taken over by the time Kate finally attempted to settle down for what she knew would be a restless night. The security team had been quietly reinforced, anticipating increased media attention in the coming days, and additional staff had been brought in to handle the flood of correspondence that was already beginning to arrive. Lying alone in the bed where she had slept beside William for so many years, Kate found herself experiencing a strange mixture of relief and grief. The decision had been made, the announcement had been delivered, and now they could begin the long process of building new lives from the pieces of their old one. But the finality of it all was still sinking in, and she understood that the hardest parts were still ahead. The silence in the castle felt different now, not the tense quiet of unspoken problems, but the hollow emptiness that follows after a storm has passed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult conversations, and the beginning of a separation process that would be scrutinized by the entire world. But tonight, Kate allowed herself to mourn not just for the marriage that was ending, but for the simpler life she had left behind when she chose to love a future king. The woman who finally fell asleep in the early hours of the morning was not the same person who had awakened the day before. She had been transformed by loss and disappointment, but also by the recognition that she possessed reserves of strength she hadn't known existed. The future was uncertain, but it was hers to shape, and that realization brought with it a small but growing sense of possibility that would sustain her through the difficult days to come. 3 months had passed since the announcement that shocked the world, and the initial media frenzy had settled into a more manageable rhythm of ongoing interest and speculation. Kate had moved into a beautifully restored Georgian mansion in Richmond, close enough to Windsor to facilitate the children's routines, but far enough away to provide the psychological distance necessary for healing and growth. The house she now called home had been chosen carefully, with input from security experts and child psychologists who understood the unique challenges facing her family during this transition. It offered privacy without isolation, elegance without ostentation, and, most importantly, spaces where her children could continue to feel safe and loved despite the dramatic changes in their lives. The morning routine in Kate's new home had taken on its own rhythm, different from but no less meaningful than the structured days at Windsor Castle. She had chosen to take a more hands-on role in her children's daily care, driving them to school herself when security permitted and being present for homework sessions and bedtime stories in ways that had sometimes been difficult to manage within the constraints of full-time royal duties. Her children had adapted to their new circumstances with the resilience that seemed to be their birthright, though Kate knew they continued to process the changes in their own ways. Their questions had evolved from the initial confusion about why Mummy and Daddy weren't living together anymore to more nuanced inquiries about holidays, birthdays, and family traditions that would need to be reimagined for their new reality. William had been exemplary in maintaining consistent contact and involvement in their children's lives. Their co-parenting relationship had developed into something that surprised both of them with its effectiveness and mutual respect. They had discovered that removing the pressure of trying to maintain a romantic relationship had actually freed them to be better partners in the one area where their connection remained most vital, their shared commitment to their children's well-being. The practical arrangements of their separation had been handled with discretion and efficiency by teams of lawyers and financial advisors who specialized in high-profile cases. Kate's future had been secured in ways that would allow her to maintain her independence while ensuring that their children would never want for anything. The financial aspects, while complex, had been resolved with surprisingly little acrimony, perhaps because both parties understood that their real treasure lay in the family they would always share. Kate's role within the royal family had been carefully redefined through a series of private negotiations that balanced her desire for independence with the institution's need for stability and continuity. She would retain certain ceremonial duties and maintain her patronages, but with greatly reduced obligations and increased flexibility to pursue her own interests and causes. This arrangement satisfied everyone involved while providing a model for how the monarchy might adapt to changing social expectations. The media attention, while still intense by ordinary standards, had become more manageable as other stories claimed the public's attention and the initial shock of their announcement faded into acceptance. Kate had learned to navigate the ongoing interest with greater confidence, understanding that some level of scrutiny would always be part of her life, but that she could control how much of herself she chose to reveal. Her personal growth during these months had been remarkable to observe, according to those closest to her. Friends who had known her for years commented on a new sense of lightness in her manner, a return of the quick humor and easy laughter that had sometimes been subsumed beneath the weight of royal responsibilities. She seemed to be rediscovering aspects of herself that had been dormant during the most difficult periods of her marriage. The charitable work that had always been close to Kate's heart had taken on new dimensions as she gained the freedom to speak more directly about causes she cared about. Without the constraints of representing the monarchy in every statement and appearance, she had found her own voice on issues ranging from children's mental health to environmental conservation. Her advocacy had become more personal and, in many ways, more effective. William, for his part, had thrown himself into his royal duties with renewed focus and energy. Those who worked closely with him reported that he seemed more settled and decisive, as if the resolution of his personal crisis had freed him to embrace his future role with greater confidence. Their parallel paths toward healing and growth had become a source of mutual pride rather than competition or resentment. The children's relationship with both parents had actually strengthened during the separation, perhaps because they now received more focused attention during the time they spent with each parent. Kate's weekday routines with them had become precious opportunities for connection, while their weekend visits with William often included special activities and adventures that created new positive memories to balance the difficult emotions surrounding their parents' separation. One particularly significant moment had occurred 6 weeks after their separation, during their daughter's school play. Kate and William had attended together, sitting side by side in the audience like any divorced couple supporting their child's achievement. The sight of them together, clearly comfortable in each other's presence despite their changed relationship, had reassured their children and surprised observers who had expected ongoing tension or awkwardness. After the performance, as they stood together receiving compliments from other parents about their daughter's excellent performance, Kate and William had shared a moment of genuine pride and connection that reminded them both why they had fallen in love in the first place. They were different people now, with different needs and different dreams, but their shared values and their mutual love for their children had created a foundation for a new kind of relationship. The anniversary of their separation had passed quietly, marked not with drama or public statements, but with a simple exchange of messages acknowledging how far they had all come in learning to be a family in a new configuration. Kate had spent that day reflecting on the journey from the pain of their final morning together at Windsor to the peace she now felt about their decision. In her Richmond garden, where she had spent countless hours that spring planting flowers and vegetables with her children, Kate found herself thinking about growth and change in ways she never had before. The metaphors were obvious, but no less meaningful for their simplicity. Sometimes the most beautiful gardens required the difficult process of removing plants that were no longer thriving in their original locations. Her relationship with William had evolved into something that neither of them had anticipated when they first made the decision to separate. They had become genuine friends again, freed from the expectations and disappointments that had clouded their marriage during its final years. They could laugh together about their children's antics, consult each other about parenting decisions, and even share comfortable silences without the weight of unspoken resentments. The public narrative around their separation had also evolved, moving from initial shock and speculation to a grudging respect for how they had handled an impossible situation with dignity and mutual consideration. Royal biographers were already beginning to reassess their relationship, suggesting that their separation might ultimately be seen as a modernizing moment for the monarchy rather than a crisis that weakened the institution. Kate's future stretched before her now with possibilities she was only beginning to explore. There were conversations about writing, about expanded charitable work, about travel, and experiences that had been impossible during her years of intensive royal duty. She was still young, still energetic, and now possessed a wisdom and self-knowledge that could serve her well in whatever directions her life might take. The children had begun to talk about their future with excitement rather than anxiety, making plans that included both parents and step-parents who might someday join their extended family. Their resilience and adaptability had been perhaps the greatest gift to emerge from this difficult period, proof that with enough love and support, families can survive even the most challenging transitions. As summer settled over Richmond, Kate found herself experiencing a contentment she hadn't known for years. The silence that had once felt so heavy between her and William had transformed into something else entirely, not the absence of communication, but the presence of understanding. They had learned to say goodbye to one kind of love while preserving another, and in doing so, they had given their children and themselves the gift of a peaceful future built on honesty rather than pretense. The fairy tale was over, but the real story of growth, resilience, and the many different ways that love can manifest was just beginning. In learning how to end their marriage with grace, Kate and William had discovered something perhaps more valuable than the happily ever after they had originally sought. They had learned how to build happiness from the honest acknowledgement of what was real rather than what they had hoped might be possible.